Hey, yo, it's me, Pops Van Marmalade, and you're watching the Comics-Related Madness Network. Uh-huh. So come get some. CromCon. CromCon.
If you're a fan of comic books and comic book conventions, Daytona Beach Comic Con needs to be on your list of must-attend events. It's a show that actually focuses on comic books. Imagine that! This year's event is happening on Saturday, September the 6th, and Sunday, September the 7th. Silverline creators will be there, so we'll see you at the show. If you find yourself in the Orlando area, and let's be honest, doesn't everyone come to Orlando for the House of Mouse? Head over to Coliseum of Comics to get your comic book fix. Be sure to check out their location on East Colonial Drive, where they carry a wide selection of independent comics, including Silverline books. Stop by and don't forget to tell them Silverline sent you. Hey, if you're an independent comic creator looking to get your comic printed, look no further than Kablam Digital Printing. They print our comics and do a fantastic job. They can even print special edition covers. When you reach out to them, be sure to tell them Silverline sent you. Looking for a bold way to boost your business? Advertise with Silverline Comics, reaching readers across the U.S. and around the world. Affordable rates, passionate fans, and national and international exposure, all packed inside thrilling, action-packed comics. All ads must be PG-13, perfect for reaching all ages. Spots are limited. Grab your ad space today and become part of the adventure. Silverline Comics, where adventure lives and your brand thrives. Email us at silverlinepublishingllc@gmail.com for more information. And make mine Silverline.
Hi, this is Tim TK, host of That Silverline Show on Tuesday. Join us at 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific every Tuesday night as we discuss pop culture and the joys of making comics.
Hi, I'm Barb Kelber, co-host of Silverline's Wednesday Wham. Join us each Wednesday nights as we discuss comics, literature, movies, and anything else that may catch our attention.
I'm Roland Mann, and I host Silverline's Silver Sunday. Join me every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern as we make mine Silverline.
Hello, Internet. Welcome back to Let Someone Show on Tuesday. I'm your host, Tim TK, joined as always by David Rios.
Hello.
And joined as Days of Future now always, Brent Larson.
Yes, Days of Future, or Days of Future Past, Days of Future Present, or just days. It feels like days.
Sometimes, yeah. All right. And tonight we'll be talking about creating a realistic fantasy setting. So there will probably be a lot of talk about writing as it goes into world building and all that fun stuff. But really the world building comes down to the entire creative team. So, and I guess also a disclaimer here in that if you are writing a fantasy setting and if it's not your goal, it does not need to be realistic. One of the best fantasy stories of all time is, Final Fantasy VII. That world makes no sense, but it's great. So, as a disclaimer. But if you are wanting to do something like Joe Abercrombie or Brandon Sanderson and have some really hard, tacked down world building, this will be kind of where we get into how you can do that for your comic or whatever your story of choice will be. So getting into it, I'll open up the question to the floor. What are you guys' experience with fantasy worlds, whether it be creating and world building or just ingesting and consuming them as a fan?
Well, I'll just say, a big thing for me is ingesting them. But I mean, we work in this industry, so we're also technically creating them as well. So
yeah.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny. I mean, I started reading Lord of the Rings when I was just a kid. And it never struck me that I was looking at anything that was hugely foreign to where I lived, which maybe was kind of the point. When you're building a world, you don't want to build something so utterly remote and alien that people don't want to be there. Like I remember when Avatar came out, and people were literally suicidal because they wanted to live on Pandora more than they did their own reality. In a way, you kind of want to do that, I think, if you're creating or even if you're wanting to ingest. It's hard to really accept a fantasy world that's really ugly and distasteful and has no connection with, the world you live in now. You want a place that's better than what you've got, or at least more interesting, I think. So if you mentioned like if you're going to play something like Grand Theft Auto, I mean, it's not exactly a fantasy world, and yet it's more vivid than what you've got. That's probably why you're never going to see a lot of video games that take place in a subdivision or something like that. I think what you want is in a fantasy world is something that's more vivid than what you've got. That's a good place to start anyway, I think. So
yeah. That's something. I mean, the golden rule of writing is write what you know, right? And then when you're working on your art side of things, you always start by drawing from reference. And that was some advice I got first out in world building: is when you're trying to understand how to build a world or a setting, look at how the world actually works around you and how towns and things got settled. And I'm saying, like, well, okay, I live in what's a logging town outside of what was a trading center. So it makes sense that if I'm writing this world, I'm going to have, if I'm stapling these cities across a river, I'm going to have probably one primary trading center and maybe some resources hubs that would float stuff down to that trading center. And okay, now I can extrapolate from there on, okay, what if this, logging town is actually run by elves instead of being Tolkienian foresty elves that live in harmony with the nature? What if they're a bunch of lumberjacks? And extrapolate. But that it's the idea of, you are looking at this world and you're wanting to aggrandize it to make the world its own character, because with Lord of the Rings especially, Middle Earth is almost a supporting character in the story, and you care just as much about what's happening there as you do as with is Aragorn going to live up to his destiny, that whole thing.
Yeah. The movies are a good example of that. I love the Lord of the Rings movies, and a lot of it has to do with this place where you're going there and you're just overwhelmed. I remember when the Hobbit movies came out, that was the thing I was looking forward to the most, was not the characters, not, oh, we've got more dwarves, awesome. Actually, it was more about this vivid place that was not where I lived. And you could be like, well, such a place exists in this world. It's called New Zealand. And yet, that's not New Zealand. That is Middle Earth. It's great. You don't have to deal with things like going to a job, or if you did, you'd be doing a cool job like being a blacksmith or a wizard, or I don't know if wizards ever got paid, but it's just where you're just going, dude, this is just a better version of the world that I'm used to. In a weird way, I almost feel like that's why zombie properties are so exciting. It's because people are just fed up with modern living. They want to get rid of all the little chintzy stuff that they know they have to care about but don't want to go back to a world where survival meant more and was harder, but also more rewarding. So that's why zombie movies never take place again in suburbia, unless you're making fun of it. It takes place in a fantasy world where you don't have to care about the stuff you have to care about. You get to care about much more interesting things, I think. So,
yeah. Yeah, here's one. Like at the end of the day, what we're doing when we're creating media is providing escapism in some way, and escapism is incredibly important. Going back to like the oldest profession was the storyteller around the fire, and even when you're dealing with something as dark and gritty as a zombie apocalypse or even like Game of Thrones, there's still so much work that goes into making the world believable and alluring that you even when you're watching the battle at the bay and everyone's dying, you're like, I could live in King's Landing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I read the books too, and George R. R. Martin spent a lot of time talking about how corrupt all the everything was in King's Landing and how it actually was a terrible place to live. And yet you're like, yeah, I think I'd still rather live there than like in my Orlando suburb where I got another letter from the HOA about having to pressure wash my driveway. They don't have to deal with that in King's Landing, I'll bet. So
absolutely. And I'll kind of pop over here to David and get some idea on some of the more visual sides of things. One of the things that sounds to me, especially when we're looking at some fantasy settings, I think of a good example would be Final Fantasy, but also like the Elder Scrolls worlds where people like legitimately have spent thousands of hours in just wanting to make that their digital escape or that the life they're trying to go to. And one of the things that always stands out is the strength of the color palette of, Skyrim has those, the Nordic Aspen vibe. Final Fantasy VII, lots of green Mako on steel beams. Awesome stuff. So when you are coloring a fantasy setting or a fantasy world, what are some of the thoughts that you're having? You're coming to the palette because obviously you do match it kind of what it looks like in the world, but comics of course don't always match up to our own coloration. There are choices made and decisions made that will influence or make things pop or make things fit into a nice palette as opposed to being the widespread nightmare that is driving through the suburbs sometimes.
Well, we had been talking about on a few of the streams before. We were talking about westerns and all that, and in things like westerns and stuff, you really tend to focus on a lot of wash colors, browns, things like that. Whereas whenever you start thinking about more of the fantasy setting is where you really start to play with your, higher saturation, your brighter colors, because you really want to go and make things pop, particularly, in the Magicscape and stuff like that. So you may, the darkened area, or the magic areas that you're going into may, breathe a lot of like greens and stuff like that. Kind of if you kind of think back to like the mage books with Mirth and magic is green and all that stuff. You really can play around with a lot of that, and you also kind of push the color palette because you're trying to create that surrealism. So if you think about ogre sitting around the fire, you really are pushing kind of more of a saturated a dark area with the a rich deep red from the fire and all that. Just a lot to establish mood. Think about your you think about like a vampire type theme or something like that. You would push a lot of a lot of dark hills with like more bright purple skies for the nights and stuff like that. So a lot of that is pushing those saturations to take you even more out of that real world. That because you look at our screens right now, for example. There's some light, some decent light playing, particularly around Brant, as we talked about earlier. But there's a lot of the colors are all, reality is in general fairly washed out, unless you're talking about a field of a whole bunch of beautiful different types of flowers and stuff like that. But in general, most of the life that we see and interact with day by day is pretty washed out. So all of the aspects, in the artwork of distortions and stylizing the characters, and from a coloring standpoint, is pushing those colors and really, making it a little more unbelievable, but in the fantasy scape, which is a lot of what kind of Disney does in their animations. They really push that and bring that just a little more, push it a little bit more, make it a little more brighter, a little more happier, and stuff like that. So you can do that a lot. And for dramatic effects, the big, death scene, or, so-and-so falling into the pit of lava, stuff like that. So there is a lot of, again, like you discussed, kind of trying to take you out of the day-to-day runs of average life and into this rich, fulfilling environment that it looks pretty, and hey, this is more fun to be here than that. And yes, I've spent quite a bit of time in the Final Fantasy game realms. So yeah.
I mean, that's always the like the volcano level. Always like it looks like the volcano that you want to die in, not the real life volcano. Yeah, it's awesome. It goes into making things visually popping as much as possible. To come back to the writing side of things, I've not had the chance to write fantasy proper. I've written sci-fantasy, which we'll get into, I'm sure, at some point later. But Brent, I want to ask you, have you had the chance to write a proper fantasy story, and what kind of world building did you put into that?
Probably the closest thing I've come to is Kalis. And it's not really okay. I'm gonna say it's probably as close as I'll get to fantasy writing, and that is where Scott and the rest of the crew of the Achilles fall into the Kalis Rift, and they come out on the other side, and they're in a world that doesn't make sense, and the sky is a different color, and they don't know what the deal is with the sun. They assume they're on the they of course they don't know where they are. They've fallen through some kind of rift in space. And the clothes are kind of familiar. The vegetation is kind of familiar, but kind of not. And when I was trying to figure out how to describe the world, the thing that really sold it, kind of what Dave was talking about, was the colors did it more than anything else. Because people can look at, if you don't have trees and you're outside, okay, well, that means you're in a desert. But you can say, but I'm in a fantasy world where there's no such thing as trees. Nobody, that doesn't make a lot of sense. People want trees. Why? Well, because then you're in a quasi-recognizable place. If you're going to totally rewrite something with all new physics and how did life come about on this planet, and or wherever you are, that's a lot of narrative you have to explain. And if your story isn't about that, well, you're burning lots of attention spans trying to get your readers up to speed, which you don't really want to do. What you want to do is get to the good stuff, like, oh, his dad was murdered and he has to, okay, are you really gonna the story's about him avenging his father's death? Is it more that, or do you have to spend a lot of time talking about how trees came to be? Because people that really don't want to know that bad. And if they do, then they're kind of the specific science nerd type who loves that kind of stuff, but they're not the huge minor or majority. So when I was writing Kalis, I really leaned a lot into Leandro, my colorist, when I just said, look, I don't want the sky to be blue. It needs to be a weird color. And the inhabitants of this place where they've landed, it needs to be something other than a skin hue that you'd find on Earth, which is why he came up with this really nice gray kind of look. And you kind of, I've thought to myself, I will at some point need to explain why these people look so different and yet have clothes that are similar to what people wear on Earth. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. So I'm almost hoping I can beg the reader's indulgence and just say, look, this is just how it is. Okay. I'll really explain it, but this is a comic book. I get 22 pages. So just look at the colors and go, dude, that looks like a really crazy place. Oh, that grass isn't green. It's like this weird, funky color. Cool. Why is it that way? Well, because it's a fantasy world and it's more fun to look at that way. That's probably the best explanation I can come up with. So,
absolutely. I mean, yeah, I kind of thing I talk about is, a couple of different things, but yeah, something we talked about before was you have the triangle of weird when you're creating a story. Is that you need to have points of grounding to have a really big weird point in order to get the reader buy-in, in order to buy into that weird point. Or you want to have trees and stuff like that, and things that make it seem grounded in some aspects, and then you can have these weird colorations or this weird time magic stuff.
I've never heard of that. That's pretty good.
Yeah, something that I picked up from college, but I always think of kind of the classic Eastern fantasy trope of eventually the end goal is to kill God. So when you're in the normal planes and normal stuff, everything looks fairly normal until you get to the realm of the gods, and that's when you're suddenly standing on weird, disjointed rocks and geometry in space with ether floating around you. And it's this really incredible visual, but if that was the entire story of that entire setting, you'd have nothing to really ground yourself in, and it'd feel bland by itself just existing there. But you can put that in contrast to the normal or to the grounding points that are in your story. You can really pump up the level of the spectacle there. But yeah. And like you're saying, there are some points where as the creative team, you have the ability to say it's like this because it is, and it's our story, and that's what we're doing. That's why the grass is purple, and that's perfectly acceptable. And then, depending on how neurotic you get about your storytelling, you could go the Brandon Sanderson route in Mistborn, where there is a hard reason why all the vegetation is brown, and he explains that well, due to this thing that happened a while ago and all the iron being saturated into the earth, it created this, oxidizing effect in the vegetation. And you don't need to overload that at the front. You can trickle that information out throughout the rest of the story and kind of, and the nice thing about that is you could treat it as it's a creative choice because it looks cool to make the grass purple. And then going to the next volume, we could have the sun like, well, what if the grass is purple because of this? And you could start sprinkling in hints and like, well, and then when someone asks you in an interview, you say, oh no, this is always a plan. I just thought about it 8 steps ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a trick. I've done that a couple of times with the different stuff I've written. It's almost like you don't have to explain the whole world. You just have to tell the reader that you have thought about this particular angle and that it's just interesting and it's a fun little factoid. And that's kind of, and I mean, as a writer, I have to have those things because I'm not an artist. And therefore I have to keep the reader engaged in a way that is kind of visual, but I don't have to rely on my I can do that through words, and that is to create a small story point that make people go, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then you just kind of leave it alone and you move on. And it makes your reader feel, for one, like you've actually invested something in your story, other than just saying, well, it's like a fantasy world, only everything's the same as it is in, I don't know, Wisconsin. And then people are like, oh, you're not really trying very hard. So,
yeah. I mean, there was, that's actually a very interesting example. I believe it was, oh man, I'm trying to remember the name of it now. I have a Google. Okay, it was The Law on Earth by Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter, which is a very interesting sci-fi story, but it kind of goes sci-fantasy at times because the science doesn't really work. It's kind of held together by weird Buddhist mysticism, which is interesting. But the idea starts off with it's Madison, Wisconsin, as you know it. That's the exact setting. Nothing has changed. But at some point, a nuke goes off in there and ends up creating a point where now there is an interconnected timeline between all the alternate Earths and all the alternate dimensions originating from this one point. And from Madison, Wisconsin, you can just take a step out into an alternate Madison, Wisconsin. And things will get progressively weird as you go down the line. But it starts from this grounding point of real life Madison, Wisconsin.
That's fun. So you're actually you took something that was real and then just kind of turned it on its head.
Exactly, yeah.
That's really the best kind of writing. Yeah.
Well, think about what they did in Stranger Things, for example, with you're in the same place, but you're in a different dimension. And that place is very cold, very just completely different. And you've got a lot of things that you can do that way. Those gateways and things are a fairly easy way to change things up. But then I was just thinking earlier, one of the other things is another alternate way to do it is to kind of approach the breaking the fourth wall type thing. Have your character interact directly and say, well, the sky is purple. Because who says the sky has to be blue? And you're done. However you want to do it. There's just lots of fun ways that you can, address that. From a writing point. I'm not the strong point on that, but it makes things interesting.
That is the same. That is the exact technique that was used in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Because there's at the point where Arthur Dent is now talking with God as they're going through the universe, and he's asked him all these questions, and God's like, "I felt like it." I remember there's something he said like, "Oh, that was Gabriel's decision, not mine. I don't know."
Yeah.
But yeah, there are certain times where you can do what's called a hand wave, where you have a throwaway line where a character who falls into the mentor or the guide type role just kind of says, "Oh, this is the thing because it is," and you just kind of hand wave the situation. And if you're done a good job writing up to that point, that's usually enough for the audience to buy in. And there are other times where perhaps you need to explain things, go and do it, and build out the depth of the world, and that will also create more intrigue into it. One of my favorite modern writers in multimedia is Yoshi P. And something he likes doing is he'll just do a lot of dangling threads where he'll write something out and he'll say like, "Oh, this is because of these people that were alive 1,000 years ago. I'm not going to touch them now. If the people are interested in that, we'll come back to it later."
Yeah. I'm totally on board with that.
Yeah.
If anything, it's like the writer is saying, "Oh, I know what's going on, but I really just can't tell you." And if they do that too much, like I think about the show Lost, they might have done that too much in that show.
Too much hand waving.
People got fed up. But if you do it enough, do you remember that old episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation when they or maybe it was Deep Space Nine. Someone's gonna fact check me on that. But where Worf goes back in time and sees the Klingons the way they were portrayed in the original series, where they didn't have the bony ridge.
Yeah.
And his response was something along the lines of, "It's an embarrassing thing. We don't like to talk about it." As if to say, there's a story there, but I can't tell you what it is because we don't have time. And no one was like, "Well, that's dumb. How come we didn't talk?" Because they accepted. Actually, okay. Just acknowledge it. It's okay.
Yeah,
that was the Deep Space Nine.
Yes, that was
the Tribble
Yes,
crossover, the
that's
Tribble
right.
episode. Yep.
Yeah, the way I think about it is like, when you go to like Star Wars is an interesting example in that it's an example of hand waving a good explanation and then over explaining to the point of ruining the concept.
Mhm.
When they're talking about the Force, is that in episode 4, Obi-Wan says this: "So the Force, it exists, it permeates through us, it's this life force, it is what it is." And we're like, okay, great, cool. We just kind of hand wave the Force exists and there's wizards. Episode 6, we get this interaction with Leia and then Yoda and Obi-Wan mentioned in the Ghost, but they kind of talk about like, oh, the Force is passed on through families. It's like a genetic thing. We're like, okay, yeah, makes sense. You have wizard families, cool, that's great. And you get a little more of like in-depth explanation. We get like, oh, there's more things they can pull in if they want to go into like the lineages of these wizard families. And then we go into episode 1 and we get midi-chlorians and they go into like really over-explaining it and we're like, okay, we've overbaked this. We have killed the magic in the magic. And yes, Luna, we're talking about realistic fantasy settings and how you can get away with as a team, how much detail you need to go into in any given time.
Yeah, agreed.
That's the difference between full fantasy and realistic fantasy. Well, I'd say realistic fantasy just means that it's something that the facts are grounded there. So I'd say something even like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings are realistic fantasies in that they have grounded world building. And then you have low fantasy, which I think is probably what you're talking about, like low fantasy versus high fantasy, where low fantasy doesn't really deal with like dragons and magic. It's knights and swords and ancient relics, and then high fantasy is elves and dragons. But I'd say both can be realistic. The D&D world is very not realistic, and they have not done a lot. Like the world building exists, but it's very like they didn't really come to a conclusion on how the Forgotten Realms economies work or how those things mesh together until 20 years after the fact. Whereas something like Game of Thrones or the Middle Earth, there are documents explaining, the diplomatic relations between Gondor and Rohan and how their trades have interacted and all this other stuff. Yeah. And it's those things you don't need to explain all that in the go. You can kind of unravel it as things go or hand wave certain things. In Lord of the Rings, the feud between the dwarves and the elves. It gets hand waved in The Hobbit. They explain it a little bit more in Lord of the Rings proper, where Gandalf and Gimli, Legolas and Gimli talk about, well, Mirkwood doesn't really care. We were neutral in the whole thing. And Gimli talks about like, well, all right, yeah, but those Rivendell elves, they kind of screwed us over at one point. And then you go into the Silmarillion and the War of Wrath, and you actually get the full history of why that existed. And so there are different layers that you can explain the thing. And so like that, yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of that, too, is going to be whoever the writer is. Like Tolkien loved world building versus like C.S. Lewis and his Narnia books. I think when the first Narnia movies came out, people were like, oh, cool, we're going to get Lord of the Rings. Yeah, not really. C.S. Lewis is not he didn't enjoy the world building aspect the way Tolkien did, who loved inventing languages and maps. And so, of course, Tolkien's going to lean into things like trade agreements and lineages. And he probably did a lot of that in his own spare time. And I've sometimes thought, I wonder if Kalis would do better or would do to have that level of world building But I keep coming back to the fact that, for one, I really do only have 22 pages per issue to work with. And two, Tolkien worked in novels, which frankly is a medium that is very much centered on the ability to do world building. It's the primary media for it. When you have movies, you have a special effects budget you have to work with. Of course, now we've got AI, so ask me again in 2 months. Maybe everything's going to be different. I don't know. But then you got comics, which, yes, you're not limited by drawing, but you are limited by pages. And the fact that even something like the fact that even a monthly book, a month is kind of a long time to go between two, if you're telling one story and you got to wait a whole month to read the next chapter. Well, then suddenly your world building is going to need to be really on point and easy to fathom when you first look at it, or else you're going to get lost. You'll probably not ever read a comic that really delves into the nuances of a trade agreement between two warring races. You just don't have the time.
Well, the other thing is, from a standpoint of world building and everything, the difference between comics and movies and books are, you go in a comic, you open it up, you have so much in front of you. You have a visual representation of what you're looking at and all of that on a single panel. Whereas from a novel point of view, that could take pages to define the scene and put you in that scene. And same thing with movies, is you have that whole instant gratification where you're in on first visual and you've got a sense of where you're going.
Yeah. To answer your question, Luna, yes, there is a genre called low fantasy, which is just by definition fantasy without magic, without the importance of magic. So Game of Thrones, the first couple books fall under that. And then Joe Abercrombie's First Law saga is interesting because it tells the story of a world going from high fantasy to low fantasy as industrialization takes over. And Narnia was a novel, and they got turned into a movie and a bad television show. But
has that dropped yet?
There was it was an older one around the same time as Dune. But the new one I have hope for. But C.S. Lewis as a character is an interesting person in that he was did not pay much mind. He is a notorious pantser, and also was not very critical of his own work, in that he's not critically engaged with his own work in an interesting way. That he's very often stated, "Oh, I hate allegory. I'll never write such a thing." Despite writing was very clearly 8 books of allegory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's dearly loved. Kids love the Narnia books, but then again, you don't see a lot of kids running around going, "But wait a minute, how did the animals get along if they eat each other? And did they need some kind of an agreement? Was there a treaty? How did species keep from?" Kids are like, "Oh, they talk. That's really all I need." So
yeah. I mean, he kind of tried to go back to it with was it the Alchemist, or was it the Wizard in the Attic, where he talked about like the old magic where Aslan wrote on the stone and all this other stuff, but it wasn't as good as the rest of the series. So just kind of where was I going? Oh, but yeah, to David's point, comics are a very visual medium, so you can do a lot of that. Pointing to history, pointing to these threads without fully unraveling them at any time by incorporating the visuals into your storytelling. Because you could, Tolkien will take a lot of time to explain the beef between the elves and dwarves, but if you take a moment where in your comic, if you're having a character meet with, an elven whatever, and there is a manuscript or a document in Dwarvish that has a dagger through it on the table, you get that point across.
No.
And then if you want to go back later and turn that into a main story, comics work really great if you want to turn your world building into continued stories or into main lines. Thor did this really well, but the whole idea of like, we're we'll talk about the thing that happened in the background. We'll kind of hand wave at it or like do a visual point to it, and then we'll come back to it. And now that'll be a new arc that we'll explore. It's not going to necessarily have these grand expositions or these side stories that happen, but you're going to create threads that you can then explore later. But you're adding that depth and that history that you can go back to later.
I imagine you actually, Tim, had to deal with a lot of that when you were working on Wolf Hunter.
Kind of, yeah. Because there were a bunch of things that happened at that time, but didn't really like have a chance to. Not so much with Wolf Hunter the main, because that was we tried. For that reason, I wanted to keep Wolf Hunter Volume 1 contained as a bottle story, because it helps kind of plug it in. But on the Christmas special, there were several things that happened at that time that we kind of allude to or point to. One of them being the bombing of the BBC building and these different things that had occurred, or almost occurred. And so we kind of have this story at this good center point of this, of like the German radio man, the guy in England who is radioing locations to the Luftwaffe. So we can kind of point to a lot of things, but not necessarily have to go into detail with them. The main thing was actually with my new thing, Soul Ascendant, which is the sci fantasy book where, because it's based off of what if Roman mythology was in space, I have to spend a lot of time showing the different gods, pantheons, and what their people believed in quickly and visually. So we have to like visually make the distinction between Mars and Terra and Jupiter and this different stuff, and then get into it, and then only really labor a few points. And then like I was saying earlier, we make those a full arc, or like, so all of issue 1 is about the idea of domain, that gods have their own domains, and if another god steps into it, that's a no-no. And so that has to be a whole point of issue 1, or issue 2 actually, is this whole legal battle between Sol and Terra and their human representative, saying, well, Sol overstepped his bounds as a god. He can't pick a human from Earth to do this thing. And everyone will be like, well, Terra is currently on death's door. She can't pick a champion, so what do you care? I guess I don't think Harry Potter. Sorry, Harry Potter is considered a historical fantasy or secret world fantasy. Yeah.
You're not just making all this up, are you, Tim? It sounds like you actually are referring to a list of different kinds of fantasy. Is that right?
There is. Yeah. So there's a whole like list of fantasy subgenres. Let me see.
That shows how much I know.
Let's see here. Okay, here we go. Let me see if I can present this without showing anything on my background. Okay. So this is from Masterclass. These are some of the more common ones. But dystopian, high fantasy, low fantasy, magical realism, sword and sorcery, urban fantasy, paranormal romance, dark fantasy, and grimdark are two of my favorites. Fable, fairy tale, superheroes. So superhero is technically a subgenre of fantasy as well, which is why it fits in really well with comics. Yeah.
So this would consider common book landscape to be fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah, essentially. Because for the most part, things kind of, it just happened because they say they happen. Like the X-Men have the gene because, of course, they do. And there's some science in there, but for the most part, the science is hand-waved. Dystopian fantasy. So yes, Adventure Time is good at dystopian fantasy, and it's comedic dystopian fantasy, which I love Adventure Time because of that. Which, if you don't know, Adventure Time is what happens after the world gets blown up in a nuclear explosion and somehow creates magic.
Oh.
Yeah.
I've never seen one. I should.
Yeah, the first season is a little rough, but season 2... Actually, the back half of season 1 is great, and then season 2 is really good, and it continues to get good from that. So we have less than 15 minutes, and so I did say that I wanted to talk about one of my go-to methods for quickly building out towns and cities and parts of. You could even, this is a bullet point structure that works at any scale. You can scale it up or down, but it's for creating societies in your fantasy setting as the same idea that any character, in theory, you should be able to start from 3 bullet points: their positive trait, their negative trait, and their goal. And then you can expand from there. I think you can define a city in any fantasy setting with 5 bullet points and expand from there. And it's something that also, if you play Dungeons and Dragons, is a great tool for making quick D&D cities. And it's called the Guards method. And each number in there or each letter in there is a different thing. So Guards, G is government. You have to have some sort of primary government building, structure, and group. So if you want to go and use an example, let's go to Gondor, since we're talking a lot about Lord of the Rings. So government, of course, will be the White Tower, and it's also the Lord Regent. And so you can have the person and the place that fit that role, and you can expand from there. U is the Undercity. This is the center of crime or underhanded dealings or things that are in direct opposition to the government. And I can't remember the name of the bandit gang in Lord of the Rings, but it's the brigands group that operates in the sewers of Gondor, or Minas Tirith. A is for altars. And this is the religion of the group. You can have multiple altars if you want to have a pluralistic society, or if you're having something that's more monotheistic, it might be one, or you might have a city that prioritizes one god over the others. And so this is, Iluvatar. This is the white tree in Gondor, the gift that was given to Gondor from Numenor as a symbol of Iluvatar's blessing to them. R is resources. The primary economic function of your society or your town or city. Gondor, of course, has the river that runs from Osgiliath, and they've done a lot of fishing, being a Numenorean colony, but is also very heavily influenced in trade, with its position being between Osgiliath and the southern cities. So the trade aspect of it was its primary resource. Actually, it was a good trade city, and that's why it bloomed into being the capital, the southern capital. D is defenses. Self-explanatory. It's your city watch and your army. So D have the courtyard guard as well as the army of Minas Tirith. And S is your social hubs, and this is where your band of plucky adventurers are going to be having their downtime. They're going to be meeting, and perhaps who will be good places to have story interactions. And in Minas Tirith, this is in the books. It's kind of the Library of Minas Tirith plus I can't remember the name of the inn there. In the movie, they don't hit on it as much, although you do get the scenes outside of the inn in the balcony with Pippin and Gandalf. And if you can kind of hit on all 5 aspects of that, at least on the bullet point level, you will then have a lot of room to then start interconnecting them or creating sub branches, and they're really ballooning out from there. But it's just a really good way to start if you're having a hard time conceptualizing what your city is or what your society is. Just start with those 5 points, and then you're like, oh, this is actually the basis of a functioning society that would exist in today's world. How then do I expand that and make more things, or what would be cool for me to add here? And then, well, now I got to think of another city to the north. How do their resources or their defenses match up? And now you can start thinking of real life geopolitics or geoeconomics. And again, this can all be stuff that exists under the surface that you don't actually touch on. Especially in a comic, you probably won't touch on all, but you might do visual hand waves to, oh, there is a logging boat outside of the city, or, oh, there is a trade vessel that is leaving the port. And now you've visually demonstrated the world building and given a touchstone for something in there. Now, in some readers' minds, they're going to be wondering, oh, I wonder where they're going, or I wonder what more is in this world that would be fun to explore.
Yeah. Well, that was GUARD.
It was 6 points. GURIDS.
S. Okay.
Yeah, cards. Yeah.
That's really useful. I've been writing in a novel for the last year, and it's about a small town. But all of those have to play into it, because it's occurred to me that if I'm loose on one, then I had better have a good reason why. And if I'm assuming that I just can blip over it, people will. I mean, you want people to ask questions about your work in a way that causes their imagination to fire, not in a way that causes them to think that you didn't do your homework and that you don't really know what you're talking about. So, yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. I didn't create that myself, but it's something that I picked up from another writer, and that's been every time that now I think of any sort of role building, that always pops to mind as like my starting point, because it is that point of, well, now if I want to create some intrigue, what if there is a town that has no social hub? Everyone goes to work, goes home, doesn't really do anything. Well, like, okay, well, what if the main reason is because I'm putting a lot of emphasis on altars? There's actually a cult in this town that's running things, and so now that's the reason why there's no social hub, is because the altar is heavily influencing the town. So now there is this mystery to peel back for the reader, and I know that there's going to be a concrete thing for them to land on. It's not just going to be like, feel like something's missing for the sake, just because something's missing.
Yeah, that's really good.
Okay, we are in our last 10 minutes. So, if you have any other questions, or David, Brent, do you guys have any other things on this that you want to talk about, hit on? Any other parts of fantasy world building that you want to hit on?
One of the things I was thinking of earlier is how, depending on your storyline and your direction that you're going on, there are some nice ways to integrate your world that you've created with your base storyline. And one of the things I'm thinking that kind of popped in my head at the beginning of the show was Blade Runner, and how they've established a lot of things with the new technology, the flying ships, the heavily Asian culture, how it's kind of blossomed, and but then they've also established things like a lot of the rain and the darkness and all that stuff. So one thing what I was thinking about with that is I really like the fact that they put that in, and they basically just put it there as this is the way it is. This is the world. But realistically, our story is not about that. Our story is about, replicants that are going crazy and murdering people, and it's your base detective story. But they've put so much into designing the world, but not sitting there and pushing it in your face. It's like, it's just there, and you accept that's the way it is. You accept the bright and the shiny of the billboards and everything at night, and then you also accept that they spend a lot of time in the underbelly, and even as the movie progresses, they're in this world that is so new and everything, but the final battle is in this rundown building. So there's a lot of cool things that get incorporated there in the fantasy aspect of it, but it's just bringing in a fantasy aspect into your simple detective story. So there's some really cool things that I see there that are done that I don't think there was a whole lot of setup. It's just, let's bring you into this environment and then let's concentrate on our detective story. And let's filter in elements as we go along that may have, a pairing like, the synthetics, skin and stuff like that. And, the synthetics have been so advanced that, fake synthetic reptiles and stuff like that. It's just a little more aspect of a piece of it without, fully having to go and set everything up on how the world got that way. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Blade Runner's a good study in world building because, two, you're also really leaning into the kind of story you're wanting to tell. Like here, a fun exercise is take a favorite movie and put it into a different environment. So, like, what would it be like if the movie Blade Runner had been told with a Logan's Run sensibility, where everybody's wearing space age costumes and it's full daylight? It would have ruined the whole thing. It would have been a totally different movie because it's a detective story, but it's a noir detective story. So that's why Blade Runner, it's like, is there any sun in this country? And the answer is, well, you don't need it because it'll ruin the vibe of the movie. And you don't want it, yes, it's futuristic, but you don't want it to be so futuristic that it detracts from the gritty realism of the story. So that's why the final, you have your future Easter eggs where you've got, like the toys that are genetically built. That's really cool. And you've got replicants running around, and Harrison Ford's carrying a really cool blaster kind of gun. But they're also, they're basically what look like cars that drive. It's not flying cars everywhere. It's boring stuff. It's like buses still run, and littering is still a problem. Why? Because it's a city that's grungy. If it's not grungy, it ruins the vibe of the movie. It undercuts what you're trying to do, which is, that's kind of what you want to keep in mind when you're telling your story, is what are you actually wanting to the vibe, what the atmosphere. And that's where the world building comes in the best. So
yeah, and it also plays on that thing of the huge separation of society. You're down in the muck, for the majority of the movie with, like you said, the buses running, the crappy buses, but then there are the flying cars. But these people that they're in, those people don't have access to that. And then even when he goes and he talks to the guy who created them, and here's the elitist society, and everything is pristine and all that stuff, and then they drag you back into the mud. That whole separation, I think, really helps set an environment without overly going into it. You just kind of accept that, there's the privilege and the non-privilege, and you got to get your feet dirty to do the hard detective work and stuff. So.
Very much.
That was, and something that I always appreciate from Blade Runner was they did that. They did a really good job of pointing to parts of the history, or pointing to parts of the world without actually going through and when they talk about it. Part of it was Roy Batty's monologue, which was improvised. I'm sure the writer was at that point was like, "Oh, I have now material." Talking about like these salt ships burning off the gates of Neptune, all that stuff. And then for all its issues, Blade Runner 2049 also does a really good job of taking similar steps. When the big things in the Blade Runner universe is the replicant revolt on Mars, and the fact that like this has set up this whole witch hunt on like now replicants are back on Earth and we have to stop them, blah blah blah. And then Blade Runner 2049 they don't go and show you the revolt. They don't show you anything. They just show you the aftermath, and they continue to say like, well, here's the continued replications of the things that have happened in our history. And they're not important to the story that we're telling right now, but they have influenced the story and influenced the world. So we're going to show you how they're influencing the world without cheapening it with a flashback sequence.
Yeah. Which would only have served to kind of whet the appetite for people who love high adventure type stuff. But again, that's not what the story's about. So it was good that they didn't have that stuff in there.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go. So in case of the Overcop, yeah. There you go. All right. Well, this has been a Silverline show on Tuesday. I will be out next week, but Jose should be hosting. I believe next week will be some superhero trivia. So make sure to tune in for. It'll probably be a. Make sure to give Jose some kudos for taking his reins behind the hosting chair. But will probably be a fun game night. I'll be back the week after. Make sure to check out Wednesday Wham and Silver Sunday in their respective days. I don't believe we have any housekeeping to cover before we end tonight's show, unless anyone has any final thoughts or words.
I'm actually not going to be here either next week. I have a work trip, so I'll be sorry to miss that. Superhero trivia is great.
Yeah, cool. All right.
I should be here unless any emergency happens, but hopefully Jose and Ron will be back, so I'm not here by myself.
Yeah, it should be good. Okay. Well, we'll see you next time. But until then,
make mine
Silverline. The Silverline.
Hi, I'm Greg Horn. Make mine Silverline.